All right, welcome back to the show, everybody. On today's episode, we have a very, very special guest. We have Dr. Jeff Greenberg in the house. Welcome to the show, Dr. Greenberg.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Dr. Greenberg is a Regents Professor Emeritus at Arizona University. Um, Long, illustrious career in teaching, research, writing, publishing. Very, very happy to have you on here, Dr. Greenberg, and specifically to talk about terror management theory.
Great.
Yeah.
Look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Greenberg, for those therapists and people in our audience that really have never heard of your work, do you mind sharing a little bit about yourself and kind of what got you started in terror management?
Okay, sure. And I'll try to keep it short so we don't get too bogged down in it. But yeah, so I went to Penn as an undergrad, majored in psychology. Thought I wanted to be a clinical psychologist or some kind of psychotherapist. When I took abnormal psych as a psych major, and it was taught in a very biologically focused way, and it kind of turned me off to that. I was like, I don't want to just give people drugs and that sort of thing. So anyway, so I kind of was struggling with what to do with my psych major. And I took social psych in my last semester, and social psych kind of appealed to me because it's trying to understand prejudice and aggression, and post-social behavior and close relationships. So it seemed like it was, an interesting field to pursue psychological questions with. So anyway, so I eventually got into social psych programs, first a master's program at SU, then a PhD program at University of Kansas. And I met a couple of buddies, Sheldon Solomon and Tom Pazinski, and the three of us started working together on issues like self-esteem and how people defend self-esteem, different sort of ways we try and still feel good about ourselves even when there might be some threat there, like a failure experience or something like that. And then when we finished, we all kind of got jobs, luckily, in academia. I was at the University of Arizona. And we had some questions that we thought weren't being addressed by the field of social psychology. So one was, okay, we know that people do care about self-esteem. We know that people will defend it when it's threatened. We know people will get anxious when they feel their self-esteem is threatened. But we didn't know why it matters. Like, why is self-esteem important to people? So we knew we had that question, and we wanted to look for answers, and we weren't getting them within our field, within the journals that we were reading. And the other question was, we also had an interest in prejudice from way back. My master's thesis was about prejudice. And we also felt that the field wasn't really addressing what's really underlying the depth of prejudice, right? Like, so everybody has a mild prejudice here or there. You could talk about implicit bias, which is very popular right now. But I grew up in New York, and it's like prejudice was like a very strong thing, and people, the worst kinds of people have this intense prejudice. You think about KKK members, white supremacists, etc. And we didn't think our field was getting at what makes people so intense in their hatred of people who are different from themselves. So we had these questions, we had no answers, and so we decided to try to read outside our field and see if we can find somebody who really addressed these kinds of more depth kind of questions, the whys of things. And Sheldon Solomon actually stumbled onto a book by Ernest Becker called The Denial of Death, which actually won a Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction back in 1974, I believe. Unfortunately, Ernest Becker died a few months before his book won that award, but it was an influential book. Bill Clinton's a fan. Woody Allen mentions it in Annie Hall. Anyway, Sheldon said, hey, I have a guy who's got some answers to these questions. And he knew I'm a little bit lazy about reading stuff, so he literally mailed me the book. And so I felt obligated to read it. And I read it, Shelley and I started talking about it. We brought Tom Pazitsky into it, and the two of us kind of mulled around, what's he getting at? Why did it hit us so hard? Because it did. And so that's where terror management theory started, was with reading Ernest Becker's work. Becker was a great scholar, and he drew on lots of other influences. And what he came to was the idea that death, the human awareness of our own mortality, is a psychological burden that we all have to deal with. That at our core, we're animals, right? We're members of a species of animals, like a lot of other species of animals, but they're spared the knowledge of death being an inevitability, and the fact that it can happen in all sorts of ways at a time. So, in a sense, what Becker was arguing was that our intelligence, as it evolved from our, hominid ancestors, led us to this awareness that then sort of went against a lot of our biological predispositions, right? We're biologically predisposed to continue breathing, to get food, sustenance, shelter, to respond to threats with fight or flight, right? Or maybe peace, but certainly to react in a defensive way when something's threatening our continued existence. So in so many ways, we're sort of biologically programmed to want to keep going, and just like other animals. But the difference is that we also know that it could happen at any time. We don't necessarily have control over it, and that inevitably it's going to happen no matter what we do. And so Becker argued that this is a tremendous psychological burden. And as our ancient ancestors started to become aware of this, when this dawned on them, they had to cope with it in some way, right? So this would create tremendous anxiety and, like, what are we going to do now? And so what Becker argued is that what we did is we developed cultural worldviews, ways of viewing the world that help us feel secure despite our knowledge of our vulnerability and mortality. And so we learn to invest in these worldviews, and the worldviews are structured in a way that if we feel like we're valuable members of our group, valuable contributors in some way to this meaningful worldview that we believe in, then we'll feel protected and in some way even transcendent of our own mortality. And obviously the most obvious way is through an immortal soul. And so virtually all ancient cultures have believed in some kind of immortal soul, some kind of existence beyond our material being. But worldviews also provide us with ways to feel symbolically transcendent of our own physical death through offspring, through cultural achievements, that contribute to whatever field we're in, have an impact on young people that will last beyond our physical existence. And so we have both this idea of literal immortality, that some way our consciousness will continue, something about us will continue literally, like an immortal soul in heaven. But we also have these symbolic ways of feeling that, hey, we're going to continue in some way, right? So the creature that I am will die, but Jeff Greenberg will live on, whether that's an immortal soul or through my books, my writings, the impact I had on students. I have 2 kids, my children, etc. So Becker was saying that investing in these things is how we can feel secure in the world and function day to day and not sort of be obsessed with our vulnerable mortal state. Okay. And so
Wow.
we talked a lot about, we talked about the pyramids and, all the different worldviews that have ways for us to feel transcendent of death. And before you cut in there, let me just, so briefly, so when it comes down to the questions that we're asking, what is self-esteem from this self-esteem is that feeling that we are valuable contributors to a meaningful worldview. And so self-esteem is an anxiety buffer. It allows us to function with our anxiety relatively under control because we feel that we have that protection of being valued part of this meaningful world. The other question was about why groups can't get along with each other. And Becker had, I think, a tremendous answer to this problem. And you can see this, I mean, this is in politics every day. If my psychological security depends on having faith in a meaning providing worldview, right? Whether that's Christianity, Islam, Judaism, America, communism, whatever that worldview we bought into is, somebody with a different worldview is either implicitly or explicitly calling this in question. And that's psychologically disconcerting. And so the tendency is to defend our worldview against what we see as alternative worldviews that are trying to dispute our truth, right? And so we might just, so if you run into a different culture, it's very different beliefs than yours does, we could derogate them. We could just say, well, they're ignorant, they're stupid. Like, a lot of the Europeans, explorers, when they ran into these sort of tribal cultures, you just derogate them, they don't understand. Or you might think they're evil. You might think, oh, they're evil with their beliefs, so that's why they're wrong, and Or we have to do more, so we could try to convert them, right? So missionary activity. If we can convert some other group to our belief system, it makes us all more secure about the truth of our worldview. And if that doesn't work and they don't go away, then unfortunately, sometimes, a lot of times, unfortunately, in history, it comes down to let's fight it out, right? Whether it's capitalism versus communism, Islam versus Christianity, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the basics. So that's basically terror management theory in a nutshell. We have this potential to feel the terror, and we keep it under control by investing in that worldview and trying to live up to the values of that worldview, so we can feel like we're valuable contributors to that version of reality. And that's managing your terror. And so things that threaten that lead to anxiety and then defensive responses.
Wow, Dr. Greenberg, that's so many threads that we can pull on with that answer that you provided. Thank you so much for that. But before I continue asking my questions, to kind of continue the conversation, I want to go back to something you said that stood out to me. You said that we invest in our culture, whether it's religion or I'm hearing a political party, whatever it is that makes us feel secure. And by feeling secure, we can build some self-esteem. And whenever an individual comes in contact or feels threatened by somebody who doesn't share that, religion or political ideology, whatever that is, that individual may feel threatened. And can you kind of elaborate a little bit more on that, Dr. Greenberg? Or do they feel threatened because what we believe in has now been opposed by something else, and it erodes that belief? And because it erodes that belief, it erodes the self-esteem, which gives kind of that terror, so to speak, a little bit more power? Is that kind of like...
Absolutely. I mean, if my self-worth is based on, what kind of credit card I have in my wallet, or, my social site publications, okay? And you drop me into, I guess the Australian outback, and I'm around Aboriginal people, and I tell them, hey, I've got a big vita, I've published a lot. They're probably, and this may not be true of, contemporary modern Aboriginal people, but let's just take an extreme sort of example. They're going to be like, that's not valuable. Who cares? Can you ride a horse? Can you navigate this terrain?
Mhm.
That's what would give you self-worth in that context. Right?
Mm.
And Becker's, my favorite Becker book is not really The Denial of Death. It's the one we started with, and it focuses the most on death. It's The Birth and Death of Meaning, because there he lays out, how do you go from a newborn baby to a socialized adult who's an American or a Muslim or Canadian, whatever. How do you get there? So that and the way he lays it out is it happens very early. Everybody is inculcated into a specific worldview, typically, whoever raises you, right? Typically your parents. And your parents are really agents of the culture. So they're teaching you the cultural worldview, right? Now, of course, within a big culture, you could have multiple. Like in a tribal culture, it's probably, you're taught one culture, and everybody in the small culture would be taught the same thing. Now, of course, we have these giant cultures, and you have, so within the culture, you have subcultures. So yeah, you could be raised to be liberal, you could be raised to be conservative, you could be raised to be Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Hindu or atheist. Whatever it is, your parents are embedding you into a worldview, into a specific way of viewing the world, and almost always one that gives you a sense that there are meaningful things, that the world is meaningful, and there are values, right? There are things that are good, there are things that are bad, there are things worth striving for, right? And there are things that are evil at some level. Pretty much every worldview has got all of that, and we're all embedded into one of these. And sometimes we grow up and question them and shift, but most of the time we don't, at least not in a big way. Like, almost all Americans believe, freedom of speech, democracy, the importance of the ability to vote, that we should have certain rights as citizens, etc. So we're all kind of raised in that. And when you're little, you start going to kindergarten, first grade, they start teaching you history, and that history is history according to your culture, and it tends to reinforce, the cultural values of that particular culture. And you know, and it really goes back. Becker in Birth and Death of Meaning, he just lays it out so beautifully. It's like when you're little, what makes you feel secure is the love and approval of your parents. At the beginning, that's all that makes you feel secure, because they're the ones. You're hungry, they feed you. You're cold, they make you, right? They take care of you, and then it stretches out, and you got peers, and you got teachers, and you got cultural authorities, and you may or may not be taught to respect, the police, the president, obviously depending on your upbringing. But we all have these larger things. So one of Becker's base points is we're born completely helpless and vulnerable. The human newborn is the most helpless and dependent of all living creatures, cannot survive on its own. So that's how we all came into this world, as helpless, vulnerable beings. And what we're learning over the first few years is how to feel secure despite our vulnerability. And that's largely through feeling loved and protected. Parents and others, that are aunts, uncles, et cetera, and then teachers. And so the authority figures in our world, right, within our culture, become a big part of our basis of self-worth. If they value what we're doing, if you get good grades, if you're good in sports, you keep going on and on and on. And different cultures have different versions of what makes you a good person, but they all provide that. And so when you have that and you feel good and you feel secure, you feel like a good person, then you feel secure. Okay, I'm cool, whatever. I'm doing good in school. I'm good. I'm a good athlete. I'm a good lawyer. I'm a good therapist, right? I'm a good social psychologist. I'm a good professor. And so that sense of self-worth always has to be based on a worldview. It's typically the worldview that we were raised to believe in, right? And if you take all of that away, a strong argument could be made that we're just these creatures crawling around on this planet, and We're going to live and then we're going to die. And there's no meaning, there's no purpose. And in the long run, we've got no value, right? I mean, astronomy kind of teaches us that, right? It's a big, giant universe. That's not how any of us are raised, and it's not a way to get through life feeling secure and being able to enjoy your life and not be like frazzled and stressed all the time. So terror management is the idea that we manage that potential, that strong potential for anxiety, by embedding ourselves in this meaningful view of reality and living up to the values of that meaningful worldview.
Got it. Wow. Yeah. So if I'm hearing you correctly, Dr. Greenberg, it sounds like a baby's born. They feel secure with their parents. They feel loved, comforted, fed, all those great things. And then as they get older, they realize that there are ways that they can gain self-esteem, so to speak. And that is through achievement, sports, following a certain sports team like the rest of the family does, right? Or maybe being a athlete, or even you know, what was I going to say? I was going to say nerd, but being more studious, right? Maybe if they see like a parent who's like very, very studious, and they're maybe like a professional white collar, and they're pushing books, and then that child will say, well, this is how I can feel secure, is by doing what they're doing. And that in this case is, reading or practicing my handwriting or whatever that may be, or my music. And in so doing, that child starts to feel secure and building some self-esteem that helps them kind of, I don't want to say be distracted. I don't know if that's an appropriate word, but to not think about their mortality. Is
Right, because you feel protected, and it starts between 1 and 2, depending on your parents, right? But first, obviously, you take care of baby the best you can, right? But once they're moving around, it's like, well, all of a sudden, well, no, don't throw that action figure at the TV.
Mm-hmm.
If you do, parents going to get angry. That's super scary for a little kid, right? So they learn, as long as I'm good, I'm protected, I'm loved. If I do something that is judged as bad, I'm in trouble, and that's scary, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we learn very early that being good means you're secure, you're protected.
Got
And so
it.
you have so you have potty training, right? And parents are so excited when you get it right. When you get it wrong, you see either anger or disappointment in them. That's troubling, right? For a small kid, right? I mean, you're dependent on these people. If they turn on you, imagine how scary that is.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, good parents don't turn on you to the extent that that you don't believe in their love, but and so there's lots of people who grow up without a secure sense of self-esteem. If they don't have good parents, they have good parents that are fairly consistent and lay out what the values are, what good and bad is, and reinforce that. Then they're on their way to having bases of security that they carry forward. But once you go to school, then you want to be cool in front of your peers. If you're kind of a nerdy kid, then you want to please the teacher. And you see, like in kindergarten, first grade. I remember when I was in kindergarten, first grade, they asked you what's 7 times 7, whatever. Everybody's raising their hand, wants to be the one who comes up with the answer. So that's how it starts. That's how the need for self-esteem starts. And that's how it becomes an anxiety buffer. And it doesn't change over the course of your life. What the criteria for self-worth changes, obviously. What you need to do when you're 5 won't get you self-worth when you're 20, right? And so over the lifespan, how you get and sustain your self-worth changes as you take on different roles within the culture. Right. So it's sort of in some sense, it's an endless process. I mean, in my 60s, if I got like luckily, my students generally liked me and all, but one bad comment in a course evaluation, and you're like, you get a little anxiety, and then you debate, this person, you can't please everybody, blah blah. There's all kinds of rationalizations and defenses we use to patch up our self-worth when it's under threat.
And so when a person starts experiencing something that can antagonize or maybe threaten their self-worth, it sounds like it's tied to that at a fundamental, very primal level, the fear of death.
Right. Right. This is the argument we make, and we have plenty of evidence consistent with it, because that's the root basis of anxiety, is the anxiety of vulnerability. And of course, what we're most vulnerable to, and what is most scary, is death. Right? It ends everything. Whatever you like, whatever you care about, it's a potential threat to all of that. And it's interesting. People don't remember this, but kids start asking about death at about age 3, pretty consistently. Somewhere between 3 and 5, they start worrying about death. They start asking about it. They might be like a grandparent who died, or obviously you can see stuff in the media, on TV shows about death. And kids start asking it. They ask really tough questions, and we tend to give them answers that make them feel better, right? Make them feel secure. I remember when my kids were little, they'd have like a nightmare, maybe when they're 5 or 6 or something like that. I remember going into them saying, "It's okay. I got you. Nothing's ever going to happen to you." And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I'm lying to my kids, because I won't always be able to protect them from everything. But at this moment, I'm going to tell them that I can. That's what you should do, because kids aren't prepared necessarily for the absolute truth in these situations. But so our security is always based on that. It always has to come from outside. That's one of Becker's points, is that because of the way we were born, it always starts from outside, and so we're always looking for validation of both our view of the world and our sense of our worth throughout our lives.
Yeah, wow, that's so interesting.
It'd be nice if we didn't need that. Becker argues he uses the example of Schopenhauer. So Schopenhauer supposedly didn't care what anybody thought, and it turns out a biographer found out he spent hours and hours in libraries looking for anybody to cite his work, as kind of an example of somebody who acted like he didn't care what anybody thought, but still needed some kind of validation of his worth.
Yeah. Dr. Greenberg, earlier you said there's a lot of evidence to support that some of your work that you've done, some of the research that you and the rest of the team did. Can you kind of touch on some of the findings, some of the experiments that you all put together, and what those results kind of yielded?
Sure. So there's 3 basic, and there's literally over 1,500 experiments supporting hypotheses derived from terror management theory. So it's a lot. So obviously we can't go over all that. But we had 3 basic strategies, and it was hard. We had difficulty coming up with these. One was to test the idea that self-esteem is in fact an anxiety buffer. And there was plenty, so when we read Becker, there was already evidence that if you threaten self-esteem, people get anxious and they try to defend their self-esteem. But we want to see, well, what if you boost people's self-esteem? Will that protect them from anxiety? And so we designed a series of studies to show that. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. So our first study, actually, we used excerpts from an old VHS that came out back in the 80s called Faces of Death. And we put together like a 6-minute highlights from this video, Faces of Death. We're just horrifying, watching somebody get electrocuted, that kind of stuff. And we had people either watch that or a neutral video, and we before they'd watch the video, we told them that, and we gave them questionnaires earlier in the semester, and we said, okay, based on these questionnaires, we can give you a little feedback about your personality. before we get going on. And we actually told them to watch the videos because we want to see if different kinds of videos change the way we perceive time, to give them sort of a cover story for why we're showing the videos. And so so we had two conditions. We randomly assigned participants to get feedback that's either was very, very positive or sort of moderately positive. We want to see if giving them a really strong, you're destined for really great things in your life, would protect them better from anxiety in response to the death-related video. And so we had a self-report measure of anxiety, pretty standard one, Spielberger state trait anxiety measure. And sure enough, if you boosted their self-worth, they watched the death video, they didn't report anxiety significantly higher than the participants who watched the neutral video. So that was our first study. Then we got a little more elaborate, and we did a similar study where, again, we boost self-esteem, or we sort of leave it alone, so moderately positive feedback versus very positive. And then we told participants, we hooked them up to a physiograph and told them that we were going to expose them to some stimuli, and half the participants were going to be exposed to between 1 and 6 electric shocks. And we told them the electric shocks may be painful, but will cause no permanent tissue damage. And we said that when the red light comes on, that's when you'll get randomly 1 to 6 shocks in a certain time period. And that was, of course, to create some anxiety in them. I mean, again, we wanted to see is if the participants who were told how wonderful they are and how much they're going to accomplish in their lives, would they experience less anxiety while waiting for the shock? Now, the good news is we didn't actually shock them, okay? Because you don't actually do it. You just have the threat of the shock would create anxiety. And this time, instead of relying on self-report, we measured anxiety physiologically. So an indicator of anxiety physiologically is, we call it skin conductance, but it's basically how much is the person sweating. If a person sweats more, then their skin conducts electricity more quickly. And so we had equipment to measure skin conductance. And sure enough, if we didn't raise their self-esteem, the participants experienced anxiety while anticipating getting shocked, physiologically they sweated, right? If their self-esteem was boosted, they were able to anticipate getting shocked, and they didn't sweat. We had a neutral condition where they just watched lights, where they thought they were going to see lights. The people who were anticipating shock, if their self-esteem was boosted, sweated no more than the ones who were anticipating lights. So that's just 2 examples. There's others, but we won't spend too much time on sweating. So that was one strategy, was if this analysis is correct, then if you boost self-esteem or you validate worldview, you're going to see less anxiety. And both of those ideas have been supported by Becker research. Our second idea was that, well, if death really underlies a lot of this clinging to the worldview and striving for self-worth, then if we give people a little questionnaire that reminds them of their own mortality, we should see them defending their worldview more and striving more for self-worth. So we've done, and there's been like 14, we call them mortality salient studies, because we make people's mortality salient for half the participants. The other half think about either a neutral topic or, in a lot of cases, a negative topic, but not one related to death, like feeling intense pain or an upcoming exam or thinking about failure, something like that. And then we would measure things like how much they would defend their worldview if somebody criticized it. Or we would measure how much people seem to strive for self-worth in domains that matter to them. So, for example, if somebody's self-worth was tied into how good a driver they are, they would drive more boldly on a driving simulator. And what all of these, over 1,000 studies basically show is that If you remind people of mortality, yes, they defend worldview more, and they become more negative toward an opposing worldview, which ties into prejudice. And they also seem to strive harder for self-worth. So, for example, with the self-worth one, we gave people a hand dynamometer and had them squeeze as hard as they could. Okay. Then we gave them a little questionnaire about their mortality or a different topic. And then we asked them to squeeze again. And we had a pre-measure from a few weeks earlier whether their self-worth was tied to their physical strength. And for people whose self-worth was tied to their physical strength, after getting the reminder of mortality, they squeezed the dynamometer harder than people who weren't reminded of their mortality. Now, people whose self-worth wasn't tied to physical strength, they didn't squeeze harder. So that's an example of how, when you think about your mortality, you want to feel good about yourself. If part of that is your physical strength, you put that much more effort into squeezing the dynamometer to show your strength. We've also done, quite a few studies related to prejudice, but I should, mention the first study. The first study we ever did with mortality salience is we found municipal court judges, actual judges. We gave them a hypothetical case where they needed to set bond for an alleged prostitute. Okay, and we had the materials similar to what they really would look at if it was a real case. And we had half of them think of the mortality, half of them think of a neutral topic. And then we asked them to set bond for the alleged prostitute, which is it's basically bail, right? And bail could be punitive if somebody can't afford it, they have to sit in jail till their trial. And of course, bail makes sure that they're going to show up for their trial. So our thinking was judges, their self-worth is tied into upholding the law, right? And holding lawbreakers accountable. Okay, and this was in Arizona, which in Arizona prostitution is illegal. And so anyway, it was our first study we ever did of mortality science, and we got like ridiculously huge results where basically if the judges were led to think about their own mortality, they set a bond of about $300 for the alleged prostitute. And this was back in the mid-'80s, so $300 was worth more than it is now. In the control condition, when they didn't think about the mortality, they set a bond of $50. So anyway, so we've done a lot of studies like that. So that's the second strategy. We can talk more about that if you want. The third strategy was if somebody's worldview and sense of self-worth protects them from their fear of death ultimately, then if we threaten people's worldview or we threaten their sense of self-worth, death thoughts might come closer to consciousness. So we developed a measure of what's called death thought accessibility. Like how accessible is death thought to you at a given point in time? So what we do is we would threaten a person's worldview. Maybe they'd read, if they're like a patriotic American, maybe they read some essay critical of America. Or we might give them a little failure experience in a lab test to threaten their self-esteem. And then we would measure death thought accessibility, obviously, of control conditions where they wouldn't experience failure or they wouldn't have their worldview threatened. And just real simple, one way, there's a couple of ways, but one way to measure death thought accessibility is give people a word completion task. So they might get SK blank, 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 and they have to think of a word to finish that out. So we would use, we do with the words would be things like corpse, skull, coffin, dead, killed. So for example, killed, right? So you could put in KI blank blank ED, and it could be kissed or it could be killed, right? So if somebody picks killed, that means that death thought is more accessible than somebody who puts kissed, right? Anyway, so what we found is, sure enough, if you threaten people's worldview or their sense of self-worth, death thoughts become more accessible to consciousness. So that's the third strategy we've used to to sort of test hypotheses derived from the theory.
Wow, that is so interesting, Dr. Greenberg. If you wouldn't mind kind of touching a little bit on some of the, I think there's an example in the book about money and people kind of drawing bigger size coins, and then maybe if you can kind of just touch on the importance of money in reinforcing our worldview.
Right. Now, obviously, money matters more in some cultures than others, right? So you wouldn't necessarily make the same prediction about money. Yeah, sure, there's some cultures where money doesn't matter, still doesn't matter much, but obviously most do now, probably. But certainly in the United States, in America, a lot of our sense of self-worth as adults is tied to how much money we're making, right? Wealth. And not only that, but wealth also ties into this sort of symbolic immortality, right? Because if we have some wealth, then that's part of our legacy, right? So, when I grew up, my parents rented an apartment their whole lives. So when they passed on, I mean, I got some stuff from them. I didn't really care. It was fine. But I feel, but I get it. And my dad, his whole life was about making a better life for us as kids. And that's important to me as well. And so my wife and I, luckily, at this age, we were able to pay off our home. And so we feel like, hey, this will be great for our kids when we pass on. Either they can move in, or more likely they could sell it, and that will give them some income so they can buy a house of their own, et cetera. So in this kind of culture, money matters. And one of the points Sheldon made very early on when we were thinking about these ideas was that, that in a capitalist society, it's always a pyramid, right? There's always people at the top, and there's most of us, a lot of us in the middle, and then there's a lot toward the bottom. And that in a culture like this, it's hard to sustain a sense of self-worth if your income is low. You don't feel like you can take care of your family very well. You can't have the nice things that you see other people have. That makes it a little harder to feel good about yourself in a sort of materialistic sort of culture. So that's it's an unfortunate thing, and it's one reason why I think most of us would like to see the minimum wage be enough to have nice things, to be able to live one's life and to raise a family and that sort of thing. But it's tricky, and I think that I think a lot of people, and my dad didn't, his job was not one he took a ton of pride in. And there's some jobs where it's hard to take a lot of pride in them. And so he had to get his sense of self-worth from being a breadwinner, being a good dad, and he was a really good bowler, and a lot of people live, their sense of self-worth doesn't come from their career, it comes from other things, which is fine. But so I think that money gives you one way to feel good about yourself, whether that's right or wrong. It's and I use an example in the book. It's kind of silly, but a colleague of mine and we went to a conference, and we had to get from Seattle to Spokane. So we flew to Seattle. We had to go to Spokane, Washington, and we went to the rental counter. We were just going to rent a regular car, like a Taurus or something. And he said, "Well, for $5 more a day, we can offer you either an SUV or a Cadillac." And so we both and my car was like 15 years old at the time. My current car is old. But we both looked at each other and said, "We'll take the Caddy." So we got the Cadillac, this big white Cadillac. And it was on every time we got out of that car, like to stay at a hotel or to go anywhere, people would compliment us. "Nice ride." And we started getting attached to this Cadillac. And neither one of us were like into cars in that way, but it still kind of hit us. We were being treated differently because we were coming out of a Cadillac. So, so that's, you know, that's just part of the deal, And obviously, in a small tribal culture, money is less of a factor, and it's sort of how you fit into that culture and how you contribute to that culture in whatever ways matter. But in a, if there's a money economy, then money's going to play a role in people's bases of self-worth. It's something that threatens that, and that helps explain when I was a little kid. I bought sneakers from a store, and there was a little flaw in it, and it was bugging my foot. And I remember taking them back to the person, and the guy just yelled at me and said, "Get out of my store." And at the time, I was like, "What the fuck? What is wrong with people?" And still, it wasn't a good it wasn't good customer service by any stretch. But I was threatening. It was a little threat to his bottom. His ability to earn a living in his own way. So anyway, does that help with that?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Dr. Greenberg, thank you for that.
So
Earlier
if you
you
make,
meant,
just finishing
yeah,
up
go ahead.
real briefly.
Yeah,
So if you make mortality salient, people will get a little greedier, strive more for to make money, and we've shown this in a couple of different ways. But if you present somebody with a charity that they value, and you make mortality salient, they also might give more money to that charity, right? Because we also get self-worth from being generous. And so if the value of being generous is stronger at the moment than the value of, accumulating wealth, then mortality salience can push people towards generosity.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Dr. Greenberg, earlier you mentioned death reminders to some of your participants in the research studies. I imagine there's like a spectrum, like you said earlier, the faces of death videos where people are being, you know, electrocuted, killed, whatever, run over, whatever that looks like. What's kind of like on the other end of the spectrum? Like what is enough to start kind of that people
Right,
need to see or experience to start triggering some of that anxiety?
right. We certainly didn't like exposing people to the faces of death video. We only did one study where we did that. And it was very hard. And we stopped running female students. This was back in the 80s. I don't know if it'd still be the case, but female students were like reacting too strongly to it. We stopped running them. Uh, no, the typical way we did it was with two simple questions that we actually borrowed from an exercise in a death and loss class at the University of Arizona. And it asked you to indicate what emotions the thought of your own death arouses in you, and what do you think will happen to you as you are dying and once you're physically dead. And so people would just usually typically fairly short responses to those. That was the mortality salience induction that we used the most. But we've also used things like there's been some studies where you interview somebody at a cemetery or in front of a funeral home as opposed to in front of some other kind of retail business to show effects. So that can work. So, I mean, there's so many reminders of death that we can run into. You can almost get into a car accident. That can be, we obviously have done a study on using that. But that can remind you of your own mortality. If you read about somebody in your age group who died, that can remind you of your mortality. So there's lots of ways. But we also used subliminal death primes in some studies, and those actually work quite well, where you show people death so briefly on a computer screen, like the word death or the word dead, so quickly on a computer screen that they can't consciously see it. And before we did our first study, my grad student who learned the technology to do this, he showed it to me, and I was just laughing. I'm like, come on, I can't see it. Are you sure? But if you show people about 10 times, like let's say 28 milliseconds, and what you do is you mask it. So you'd show two other words. So we would say, we want you to look at two words and tell us if they're related or not. So you might have like fajita and sneaker, and that would show up on a computer screen. In between those two, flashing the word death, but at could be as low as 14 milliseconds. We typically use 28 milliseconds. And you do that like 10 times or so. And then, of course, you have a control condition where they do the same task, but they get some other neutral or maybe a word like pain instead of the word death. We got very solid effects that way. That even subliminally just making, because what it does is it makes death thought more accessible. And that seems enough to trigger people to defend their worldview or strive more for self-worth.
That is so interesting, Dr. Greenberg. Yeah, and as you were saying that, it just kind of reminded me of other symbols out there that can trigger some of this death anxiety, and those maybe ambulances, maybe seeing like those little memorials on the highway. Like when somebody gets hit accidentally crossing the street, and then they put those little, makeshift memorials with flowers and candles and stuff. That that's probably another reminder. And
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. Disasters, where a bunch of people die. Might be a little before your time, but 9/11 made a lot of Americans, if not most Americans, think about because all of a sudden here's 3,000. They weren't all Americans, but 3,000 people in New York just doing their jobs in the World Trade Center, and minutes later, they're all dead.
Yeah.
That kind of, so that's another way you're reminded of your mortality.
Yeah, and it's interesting because thinking back to that experience, I remember being in 7th grade, and it was first period, and my teacher was like, "Everybody, we're not put away your books." And then we had one of those old school TVs on the like the wheel. Anyway, he wheeled the TV out from the corner and turned it on, and I don't know how we were able to get the news, but we had like Channel 5 News, and I remember we were watching some of the footage, and I remember Dr. Greenberg being like, "I want to join the military." Like there was talks about like people were cutting in, like, does this mean we're at war? Like blah, blah, blah. And I just remember like freaking out, being like, I need to go to the desert, And so as you and I are having this conversation, just kind of makes me think of in the moment back then, I was, reinforcing my worldview by joining what I thought would kind of protect me in a way, and that was by joining the military and fighting for my country and doing my patriotic duty. And right, so yeah, super interesting.
Well, thanks. Yeah. So yeah, we all want to feel, and this is one of the reasons for all this political polarization is everybody wants to feel righteous, right? So people jump on causes and they stick to them to the end, and they go out and protest all this stuff. Everybody wants to be on the good side. Everybody wants to feel good about themselves, and causes and joining the military. There's more left-wing causes and more right-wing causes. You jump into one of those, and part of the polarization is you get too committed to it, right? You get invested in it, that you're not willing to compromise or see potentially the other side, and it's that extremism that contributes to horrible things, right? To a lot of violence, disputes, but also, unfortunately, violence. I noticed we don't have a lot more time, and I know a lot of your viewers are in the mental health domain, right?
Yes.
So can I speak a little bit to the implications of terror measurement theory?
Yes, please.
For that? Yeah, and that's actually what I was thinking about more for this podcast, but this has been fun, and I hope it's useful for people to think about these things. So I think that one way, so I think that, if you have clients, I'd want to think about what is their worldview, how are they trying to feel good about themselves and a value in the world? And a lot of times that's the problem. Sometimes the problem is the worldview is a little skewed. Sometimes the bases of self-worth, the way they're trying to feel good about themselves and feel a value isn't working for them. And sometimes you can help fix that. So for example, if they're not making friends, you can help them with social skills. But sometimes maybe the standards of self-worth they learned as a child were too extreme or don't fit them. it's not right for them, right? So maybe somebody grew up and they were told that you got to be a doctor. That's how your value enrolls to be a doctor. But maybe that's their brain isn't, you know, they're not suited to be that. It's not the only way to be a value in society. Sometimes teaching people about the theory might be useful in getting them to think about their lives. What is their worldview? What are they? Is this the worldview they want? Is this what they really believe? And then, what are the different paths to contributing to the world, to this world, and to being of value? So I think that I'd be hopeful that learning the theory can help people. I feel like it helped me. Tom and Sheldon, my colleagues who helped develop the theory, I think they feel that way as well. And the other aspect, though, is that the theory is suggesting that our fears of death may underlie some of the psychological disorders that people develop. And other people have suggested too, Irvin Yalom, Robert J. Lifton. Sometimes we fall into anxieties and depression, possibly because we don't have that worldview and self-worth to handle our death anxiety. And death anxiety is either coming out as more circumscribed anxieties, like a phobia, and sometimes it may lead to a sense of despair, which, of course, if you think about depressed people, they do think about death. They think about meaninglessness. A lot of times they don't have a sense of meaning. They don't have a sense of self-worth. So they're lacking the very things that we're arguing are how you manage the terror.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Dr. Greenberg, how might a therapist's own fear of death kind of shape the way that they practice? Do you? Yeah.
Well, I think most of the time, it drives one to want to feel of value, and that, of course, can help you become a good therapist, right? That's that you care and you're trying to help and do good for people. Now, if for some reason, there's a couple of reasons. There's a whole interesting literature now on PTSD. If somebody experiences extreme trauma, that can sort of undermine the way people are protecting themselves from the fear of death, that it becomes too raw, and it can also start to threaten the person's worldview. So a good therapist feels good about their profession, feels like they're contributing and they're doing good and helping people. But a person can lose that faith that what they're doing is of value, right? And if they lose that, then they're not going to be a good therapist, right? Because they're going to be too frazzled. They're going to be anxious themselves. And, it's not going to help them. So I think that having the rest of your life together, right, and having, let's say, a life partner who validates you and helps you feel good about yourself is going to make you also a better therapist, or whatever your occupation would be.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting question, and something that that people kind of have to explore. And obviously, a good psychotherapist is generally going to be somebody who's, in a sense, got their shit together, who feels secure in their lives and feels good about their life and feels good about their profession. And people lose that. There's a lot of burnout, right? There's burnout in the mental health professions. My wife's a nurse who became a nursing professor. A lot of burnout in nursing, where you lose the sense of the value of what you're doing, and you start questioning that, and then you become anxious. And, obviously, people do a lot of self-medicating. And we didn't get into that, but another way to manage terror is, unfortunately, is to self-medicate, right? Whether it's pharmacological stuff, prescription drugs, or recreational drugs. And there's some evidence that reminders of mortality lead smokers to smoke more, lead people who drink alcohol to want to drink more, and stuff like that. So that another way to sort of manage the terror is obviously can lead to a lot of problems. When people fall back on that as the way to handle
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting because seeing clients come in who are raised in very stressful, chaotic home environments, who are medicating in that way, it's very easy to kind of focus on the environment and think, well, yeah, your dad's doing this and your parents are doing that and your brothers are beating you up and the school's a disaster, but I think it would be really, it sounds like a prudent therapist can kind of consider that there is this terror that kind of underlies a lot of that anxiety and that fear of death. That's so interesting, Dr. Greenberg. Yeah. Oh my goodness. I feel like I could keep talking to you, Dr. Greenberg, for hours if we could go that long. But
I warned you. I warned you. We could do hours.
yes, sir. I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about your book, if that's okay.
Sure.
So this is the book, The Worm at the Core. Dr. Greenberg, is there anything you wanted to share about the book, The Worm at the Core?
Well, I think that if somebody's interested in some of the ideas that we've been talking about, then I think that this book would be a good play. I mean, Becker's Denial of Death would also be a good thing to read, and his book, The Birth, Death, and Meaning. But this book sort of summarizes those ideas that we derive from Becker, but also goes into the empirical research, and then we have chapters on childhood and the socialization process, and we have a chapter on mental health, the implications of the theory for mental health, and go over some of the empirical evidence, specifically regarding mortality, salience, and mental health. We have a chapter on physical health, the implications of physical health, and then the publisher wanted us to solve everything with our final chapter, which we were like, well, it ain't easy. But we do have a final chapter where we talk about, okay, if this analysis is true, what's the best way to move forward as an individual, as a culture, and if we're in the helping professions. So we're hopeful that our last chapter is helpful for people. And of course, so, if people are interested, hopefully they'd find it an interesting book that has value to them, both, professionally and maybe individually. I feel like, Becker's ideas and these ideas floating around help me understand other people, my friends, family members, and I think made me more compassionate to other people, because it helped me realize, we're all in a tough spot, a tough existential predicament. We should be trying to help each other get through it. So I hope that this book would also lead people toward those kinds of things. And obviously, if anybody's interested in it and then wants to discuss it or give me feedback, whatever, happy to receive all of that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Greenberg. And I'll just wanted to share that I read this book, listened to it on the audiobook. In fact, I want to read it and listen to it again at the same time, just so I can really absorb them. So good, so powerful, so much insight, so much great data. And I really appreciate that the publisher kind of encouraged the team to give us a way out, to reinforce our self-esteem in a way, because there was some times when I was like, dang, seeing myself in a lot of those examples, and so it may have produced some of that anxiety that you talked about earlier. But Dr. Greenberg, thank you so much for coming on the show. If somebody wants to reach out, connect with you, chat with you about your work, your book, really anything at all, how can they reach out?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think the easiest thing is just my email address, and it's a very simple one. It's jeff@arizona.edu. And happy to take questions or start discussion that way, or if somebody wants to Zoom, or chat any way they want, happy to do that. I'm hopeful that these ideas are helpful to people. And by the way, look, when I read Denial of Death, the first thing I told Sheldon was, "You've ruined my life," because it's harrowing. But I think once you get through the harrowing part, I think it hopefully becomes useful and helpful.
Yeah, that's awesome. Dr. Greenberg, this has truly been an awesome conversation. I really appreciate you just taking the time out of your day to come here and join me and discuss some of your research. I really appreciate it. And maybe we could do it again in the future. How does that sound?
Absolutely. I would love that. And thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. All right, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Until the next one. Signing out. Bye.